We're going to speak about the other great epic of India. The first one was Ramayana, and the other one, Mahabharata, is it's actually a larger work. It's perhaps the largest epic in the world. It's 8 times bigger, or 8 times as big as the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. So the Mahabharata, anyway, most of you can read the Roman alphabet. That Maha is just Latin magna, as in Magna Carta. And so the great, and Bharata is a word coming from a great king, an ancient king named Bharata. And so India was named after that, just like our country is named after Amerigo Vespucci, who was perhaps less heroic than Bharata. Anyway, so they named their country after Bharata. If you look at Indian postage stamps today, it'll say India in Roman script, and then in the Devanagari script it'll say Bharata. So in Hindi, basically the Indian language is the name of their country is Bharata. And just like there's a Great Britain, so this is Great Bharata, Mahabharata. So what is it? Mahabharata is sort of like the, it's like an encyclopedia, it's like a treasure chest, it's just got everything in it. It's the, it has stories, wisdom, political science. I'll read some of these quotes. I brought up some quotes so you wouldn't just think it was me professing. So, for example, the standard academic translation of the Mahabharata was begun by Professor Van Buitenen at the University of Chicago, who passed away before he finished it. But that's kind of like the standard academic version of the Mahabharata translation. So in his introduction, he says that more than any other text in Indian civilization, the great epic, when you say the great epic, it means Mahabharata. The great epic has been the storehouse of ancient lore. Countless are the single references to epic material in the lyric literature. So basically all Indian cultural expression, whether it's music, dance, literature, poetry, well, I guess poetry is part of literature, isn't it? It's a subset of literature. Anyway, all kinds of literature, and it constantly uses the themes from the Mahabharata in the sense of portraying the characters or talking about them, telling different versions of the story. Just like if you know in musicology, there's always, so like in Western civilization, there's a classic music tradition. You have people you've all heard of, Bach, Beethoven, Brahms, all those guys. And then there's folk tradition, which they all always tapped into. So there's a level of folk culture. And just like in our civilization, there's what you could call classical culture, more sophisticated culture, and then folk music, folk dance, and so on and so forth. So the folk culture of India, which is extremely diverse and developed, a lot of it is based on these stories, not only the Ramayana and Mahabharata. So this really is, as I said, the center not only of the religious history of India, or South Asia, actually, which is even more, but it's really at the heart of it. It's the cultural center of the civilization, a civilization which has lasted for thousands of years. So, as Van Buitenen says, such references show how familiar the Indian was with the events and the heroes of the epic. So familiar that they in effect became proverbial. Indian art equally shows the pervasive influence of the epic. The Bhagavad Gita, which we'll talk about, the single most important book in terms of its influence, probably the single most important book produced by this civilization, or produced by Krishna, the speaker. And so the Bhagavad Gita is within the Mahabharata. It constitutes 18 chapters in the, I guess, 6th book of the Mahabharata. Yeah, the Bhishma Parva. The Bhagavad Gita, doubtless formed within the epic, has become the most important single text of Hindu religion. This is Van Buitenen, and has inspired a complete literature of its own. The 12th book, the Book of Peace, Shanti Parva, of the Mahabharata. The Mahabharata is divided into 18 books called Parvas, or divisions. So the 12th book, the Book of Peace, contains a large number of philosophical chapters that are among the oldest documents for more or less systematic Hindu thought. Likewise, the history of Indian law cannot be properly understood without the epic, where the law is the single greatest concern. Law, for the Sanskrit word is dharma, as we talked about last time. So in ancient India, not only ancient and traditional India, if you wanted to study political science, you read the Mahabharata. Mahabharata often involves kings. It's really, it's a story, as we'll go into, a dynastic struggle among kings. And so kings would study Mahabharata as political science. People in jurisprudence would study it for law, everything. It was just like the book of the civilization. So now I'm going to give you a few quotes before I sort of set a foundation from third-party experts. There are, so what is the Mahabharata physically? Like, how did it physically survive? In India, books tended to be written in North India on birch bark, sort of white bark, birch bark, and in South India on palm leaves, neither of which last very long. So India, the climate of India, which is often humid and hot, and the materials don't last, so we don't have manuscripts thousands of years old, but there is a tradition. And so about 80 years ago, I suppose, really all the best Sanskrit scholars in the world, well, the world meaning India, Europe, America, anybody else that wanted to participate, the best Sanskrit scholars in the world decided to make a critical edition of the Mahabharata. And what is a critical edition? As you may know, the center of Western civilization up until recently was classical civilization, Greco-Roman civilization. And if you were an educated human being in the West, it means you studied the classics. You learned Greek and Latin. All the founding parents of America, I mean, people like John Adams, I'm not sure about Abigail, but at least John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, all these people were fluent in Greek and Latin. Basically, ladies and gentlemen in Europe and America knew fluently Latin and Greek. They read these classics in addition to the Bible. So anyway, it goes back into the whole history of how Christianity came into Europe and the merger, so to speak, of Jerusalem and Athens. But in any case, the basis of Western civilization was the Bible and Greco-Roman civilization. And so in the post-Newtonian world, when people wanted to be scientific, they decided that they needed to have a scholarly edition of these classics. So they'd take a work, let's say like the Aeneid by Virgil, or Homer, the most important works, the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they would gather all the existing manuscripts and they would collate them. They would kind of compare them and try to find out what was the original text. Like if we look at all these different versions, what's the oldest text we have? What was likely the original text, and so on. And so because Western philologists, Western scholars, that's the way they dealt with ancient literature, so naturally at a certain point they thought we should do this with the Mahabharata. So all the best Sanskrit scholars in the world kind of formed this team called the, I guess the Sanskrit Gators or whatever. So they formed this team and they began to gather manuscripts from all over India, wherever they could find them. What they found is that they basically they gathered, I think, 58 different manuscripts. And by that I mean 58 different versions of the Mahabharata. 58 different versions of the Mahabharata, and these 58 different versions of the Mahabharata, they divided into 11 manuscript traditions. Like, for example, there's a manuscript tradition, say, coming from East India, Bengal. And so if you look at all the Bengali manuscripts of the Mahabharata, they go into different divisions. Like some of them agree with each other, some of them differ, and so on and so forth. The great divide, as always in India, is North and South India. Sort of in the middle of India, there's some hills called the Vindhya Hills, or sort of big hills or small mountains. And so North and South India, they're divided linguistically, and South India is kind of the buckle on the Veda belt. It's just like the American South tends to be more conservative and so on. I can give various. So anyways, you take all these different manuscripts of the Mahabharata and try to figure out, the goal is, can we find out what the oldest version is? Can we work our way back to an original Mahabharata? Because like Homer, scholars generally agree that Homer did not create the Iliad and the Odyssey, but he was, as I said before, he was the culmination of a very long oral tradition. So Homer, in a sense, was taking ancient legends and putting them into poetry, did it so well. The tendency in the ancient world was that if someone was really good at something, you kind of threw out all the previous stuff and just went with that. So in the same way, the Mahabharata has a very long history as an oral tradition all around India. And India really is a country now, but historically it's more like all of Europe in the sense it's many different countries. So if you go from Indian state to Indian state, each state has its own language. Each state, or many states, have their own alphabet. They have their own customs. And so just as you could say Europe is a culture area, India historically is a culture area, but there are many different cultures within it. And so there were different sensitivities in different parts of India. So if you were orally reciting, first of all, oral traditions tend to be unstable because it's not written down. So to give one simple example, I'll give two very quick examples of the difference, say, between North and South India. North India being much more in contact with other civilizations and more, in one sense, more cosmopolitan. South India being more conservative, morally conservative, religiously conservative, and having less contact with their cultures. There's a very famous scene in the Mahabharata, just to give you an example of what I'm talking about, where a very beautiful maiden named Satyavati, who's actually a princess, but for various reasons I won't go into, is being brought up in a very remote fishing village and doesn't know her real identity as a princess. Anyway, a great sage, Parashara, one of the great Vedic sages, comes along, and this girl, Satyavati, in order to help her father out, a little extra income stream, she rows this little boat across the river, the Jamuna River, and makes a little extra money for the family. So Parashara sees this extremely beautiful young girl, this princess, and is attracted to her, and basically, invites her to, quote-unquote, just do it. Because actually they are, and although it's not talked about very much in the text, from that union, an avatar, an incarnation of God is going to be born, Vyasa, who will sort of organize all the Vedas. In any case, it's a typical story where after she gives birth to Vyasa, this great sage, this divine sage, who comes out of her womb and immediately grows up, into a sort of functioning human being, young human being. And then the sage restores to her virginity. So everybody's happy. Now what's interesting is this is the North Indian version of it. This is the North Indian version of it. In South India, if you sort of wander down to South India and you were telling these stories, and just imagine that, back then when India was mostly forest and farms, very few cities, and you were just wandering under the stars, and you're everyone works during the day, so at night everyone's gathered around, you're telling these wonderful stories, and people are offended by the idea that an incarnation of God is born out of wedlock. And so, people kind of tap you on the shoulder and tell you that you can't tell stories like this down here. This is the deep south of the Vedic culture. So what you find is in the South Indian Mahabharata manuscripts, Satyavati and Parashara get married. They get married before they beget this child. In North India, they just do it. So it's an interesting story because he invites her onto this island, and he says, let's just go to this island and beget this avatar. And she says, hello, Your Holiness. There's people all around here. And so then he just sort of creates this fog. It's like this great Hollywood fog machine. He shrouds the whole island in fog, so they have some privacy. Anyway, in South India, they get married. Another interesting thing, just to sort of give you an insight into this amazing literature, is that just as now we talk nowadays about a global village, and that's sort of a Marshall McLuhan, it's kind of like an sociological term, in the sense if you compare relationships in societies and communities. Societies by definition, people don't know each other. Everyone doesn't have face-to-face contact. It's not that everyone in American society has an intimate relationship with everyone else in American society. But in a community or a village, people actually know each other. It's a completely different degree and level of intimacy and face-to-face acquaintance. And so therefore, the term global village, sort of recreating village-type relationships at a global level. The point I wanted to make here is that in this ancient literature, we find very much what I call a cosmic village. It's really a cosmic village because there are certain great personalities in the universe, great cosmic sages, even great earthly kings and demigods and celestial demons and all kinds of amazing creatures that fascinated George Lucas when he studied them. And so they know each other, like the most prominent people of all these different communities from different worlds, planets, different sectors of the universe, they know each other. And so when there's a big event, like a great wedding with Parashara, who's a cosmic sage, the cosmic village shows up for the wedding. So that's what you get. That's the world in which all this is going on, a cosmic village, so to speak. So I told you something about the text tradition of the Mahabharata. So what was the conclusion of the scholars when they studied these sort of 11 different manuscript traditions and 58 different kinds of manuscripts, which they gathered from Kashmir, Nepal, Mithili, which is where Ram's wife Sita was from, actually, in northeast India, Bengal, Devanagari, sort of generic North Indian, Telugu, that's Andhra Pradesh, Grunta, another part of South India, Malayalam, and Kerala, and so on. So they gathered it, and there's others. There's Gujarati, there's manuscripts from all the different regions of India. And so the head of this team, Vishnu Sutankar, was a Sanskrit scholar, a very prominent Sanskrit scholar from India, and he was sort of in charge of this team, and he produced the first volume. It's a multi-volume work. And so he said, the reasons which have induced Sanskritists, both here and abroad, to undertake this gigantic enterprise, perhaps the biggest book there is, and dozens of different versions of trying to figure it all out. The reasons are easy to understand. The preeminent importance of the epic is universally acknowledged. Now, Van Buitenen, who translated it in the 70s, says about this critical edition, this scholarly edition of Mahabharata, it is clear that neither a single author nor a single date can be assigned to the great epic. After very early Vedic period. So anyway, by the time we get to the Mahabharata, as I wanted to say, the culture, you may remember, way back when we started this course, we talked about the Indus Saraswati civilization in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. And basically, the world's biggest mountains are up here, the Himalayan mountains, and it's sort of like a subcontinental divide. And because the mountains are so high, there's a huge amount of snow. In fact, the word Himalaya, the word Hima means snow, by the way, or cold, and Alaya just means a place. So the place of snow or the place of cold. So up there, there's a tremendous amount of water, and some of the water flows to the west. You get all these rivers down here. Most of the rivers are now in Pakistan. And then other rivers flow to the east, and so you get the Ganges, and then you get the Jamuna, which merges into the Ganges. Anyway, so all these rivers, you get all these rivers coming down from the mountains. So so in the early Vedic period, with you have the civilization basically here along the Saraswati River. By the time of the Mahabharata, the most prominent river is the Ganges over here. The Jamuna is very important. So in a sense, the cultural center of the civilization has shifted to the east. That's another point of the Mahabharata. There's some historical evidence. It's not all just mythology. For example, the king who's hearing all this, the whole Mahabharata is being recited to a king who is a great grandson of Arjuna, who spoke to Krishna in Bhagavad Gita. And so this king, Janamejaya, is mentioned in later literature as a real king. Like, for example, Shatabhadra Brahmana. His father, Janamejaya's father, the famous Parikshit, and his brothers were living at the time of the Brihad Aranyak Upanishad, the oldest Upanishad, the Brihad Aranyak Upanishad. And so at the time that was composed thousands of years ago, it's claimed that Parikshit is actually living. He's alive at the time that work is being composed. And so on and so forth. So another quote, and I want to get into the story because it's just the introduction to the critical edition of the text, the Sanskrit text. The critical apparatus. Critical apparatus means all the different versions, the version that the scholars picked out as the most reliable or the closest you can get to an original version, even if it's not. and then all the notes of the variations and other texts and so on. So that whole big thing is called the apparatus. The critical apparatus is a veritable labyrinth of complicated, intermingled versions, each with a long and intricate history of its own behind it. We have, unfortunately, no single thread to guide us out of the maze, but rather a collection of strands intertwined and entangled and leading along divergent paths. All the difficulties in the explanation of this phenomenal variation vanish, however, as soon as we assume that the epic was handed down from bard to bard, originally by word of mouth, as is clearly implied by tradition. So you have an oral tradition all over South Asia, and so on. Any question about that? One cannot expect this oral transmission of Mahabharata was a literal one, as in the case of the Veda. The reciter's reputation was based on his skill in bringing the old stories to life again. For example, there's a new version of Peter Pan that came out a few years ago. And so they're going to kind of, try to make it a little more zippy, get some modern computer graphics into it and everything, and, well, they did. So it's like, I mean there's stories, or for example, they come out with a new Oliver Twist, or maybe a new, or what's his name? The guy the Mel Gibson, the guy that loves violence. Yeah. I'm from Southern California, so he's a friend of a friend, and so, anyway, he really does love violence. So, anyway, Mel Gibson, he came out with a new Jesus story, and so he kind of put his own inimitable touch on it. So, it's just natural that when you're telling stories, you're competing. There's competition among reciters. There's competition among reciters. And if a story works, you embellish it. If it doesn't work, you can it, or you reduce it. Or something's really popular, they say, well, can you tell that story again tomorrow night? We just want to hear it again. So you tell it again. Maybe you just kind of get inspired. And you think in your mind, well, this must have happened and that must have happened. And you're not really cheating. You're not just like making things up. You're just kind of, the sage or the reciters kind of visualizing and thinking, yeah, I mean, logically, this is, so-and-so must have said this, and this is how so-and-so must have felt, because this is how any human being would feel if that happened, to them. And so it goes and it goes, and so you have this huge thing. At the same time, it's one of the bedrock convictions of Indian civilization, and actually even beyond Hindu civilization, that something like this actually happened. Something like this actually happened. Now, in the Bhagavad Gita, there's a statement by Krishna where he says, the Sanskrit is Jai Jatha Mam Prapadyante, speaking as God, as people approach me, Tam Sadaya Bhajamiham, I exactly reciprocate with them. And there's another statement in the Bhagavad Gita that whoever undertakes to worship whatever form of divinity, I make their faith strong. And actually they get their wishes, but actually it's the one God who's providing all these things. So in this tradition, there's very much the sense of reciprocity. And so if you approach God in a certain way, God will in a sense reciprocate. And so people will develop faith in different things. But in any case, I think it would be extremely naive. I think it would be extremely naive, and yet it is not beyond many people who feel that they are sophisticated scholars. It would be extremely naive to think that all of this, all of these stories, and the one central story, despite all the variations which I've read about, there really is a central story. And all the different versions of the Mahabharata basically agree on the central story. There's very wide agreement on the foundational story. And to say that this huge civilization which spread all over Asia, this huge civilization for thousands and thousands of years was inspired, totally inspired by this story, and yet all of this, thousands of years of sophisticated, successful civilization can be explained psychologically. It's simply been a mass hallucination going on for many thousands of years. If we study actual pathopsychology, if we study actual delusional psychology and behavior, I think we'll find that people who are seriously delusional don't tend to produce great civilizations necessarily. Because they're delusional, they tend to crash into reality sooner or later, and usually sooner. For example, Hitler was delusional, and therefore made all kinds of stupid military mistakes, and therefore the good news is we're not speaking German right now. So I think I'm not claiming here that this part of the Mahabharata is true, that part's not true. I'm simply saying that I think there's an astonishing amount of intellectual naivete and sort of pseudo-intellectuality to think that all this is going on for thousands and thousands of years, including many of the greatest scholars in history within the tradition, the greatest linguists, poets, architects, musicologists, and the whole thing is simply pathopsychology. It's simply like imagining that a big blue rabbit named Harvey is stalking me or something. It's just a complete Now, Joseph Campbell, there's sort of like a halfway position saying that this isn't simply all delusion, but actually what people in India thought was King Yudhisthira, Dharmaraj, the king of virtue, or what people thought was Krishna, God coming down to the world, or what people thought was Vyas, or what people thought was, the bad guys, like Duryodhana or Jarasandha, to think that these things are real only in a sense that people in India have sort of like this infantile mentality in which it's like children. Children can't distinguish fact and fiction. I remember when I was like about 3 or 4 years old, I looked at this little picture book, and on a certain page, this giant came down the stairs of this house and was kind of like threatening a little boy. And I remember when I would turn the page, I would actually see the dragon coming down the stairs, and I would shut the book, and I'd kind of open it again, see the giant, and close it again. So at a certain age, we learn to distinguish fact from fiction to some extent. And so to say that one of the greatest civilizations in history was simply so much in ignorance about what they were doing, they didn't know, as we now know about them, that what they thought was sacred history was really just a set of symbols. It was just a set of symbols to sort of flush out deep psychology. And because they weren't bright enough to actually have a psychology department, they kind of did it unconsciously by manipulating literary symbols or theological symbols. And so therefore we're much more intelligent. They're deluded, we're enlightened. They don't know what they're doing, we know what we're doing. I would be a little careful about that. I think that any sane human being, while not necessarily having to commit themselves to this or that sacred tradition, would be a little cautious before taking such a stand, because it's just, it's obviously the kind of stand people take before a big fall. And so, I think it's just not very prudent. It's not very prudent, especially considering the fact that civilization, if you compare it to ours, is not inferior in terms of its ability to produce virtuous, wise human beings, literature, architecture, music, philosophy, very, very sophisticated, a civilization which produced great universities centuries before they existed in Europe. And so to simply write all that off as pathopsychology, no matter how much you try to soften the blow by saying that it's a delusion which is very useful and functional, which is basically Joseph Campbell's position, it's a very healthy delusion. Because people that believe in these stories, even though it's not really happening, but it kind of, makes it. It's like the tooth fairy. For little children, losing a tooth can be kind of traumatic. And so it's very healthy for children to believe there's a tooth fairy, so they look forward to losing a tooth instead of being traumatized by it. Because do people still do that in this country? Tooth fairy? Mm-hmm. Were you indoctrinated? Yes. So, in other words, to say that this entire civilization is just a sophisticated version of the tooth fairy, a healthy delusion, or Santa Claus, I think is, to say the least, I think it's extremely pretentious. Yes?
One problem that I have, with all the religious traditions, like why at one point, like in the ancient past, there was like demons on the earth and gods intervening,
right,
coming down, and then at a certain point that just kind of stopped, and then it doesn't happen anymore.
Okay, there's different ways to look at that. You could take it some of the literature as exaggerated. From within the tradition, personally, I haven't talked to a celestial being lately, but I will tell you what the tradition would say. The tradition would say that basically it's like, why don't Americans, let's say, go for tourism nowadays to Cuba or to the Gaza Strip, where they have really good beaches. The idea is that when the conditions get really gnarly, get very nasty, people just don't go to those places. And so the basic idea that we find practically in all ancient literature, including European ancient literature, is that society is actually devolving, it's actually becoming degraded. That in the past, you find this very clearly in Homer and Hesiod, the two great ancient Greek writers. The idea that there was actually a more advanced civilization, and in that advanced civilization, there was much more contact between people in different places in the universe.
So you need to be like at a certain intellectual and spiritual level.
Yeah, and this planet has simply become, is no longer a desirable tourist destination for celestial beings. I mean, that's what they would say. It's just like if you go to the State Department's website, they'll tell you that, you should avoid traveling to certain places because it's dangerous or it's not nice right now. And so that's how it would be seen within the tradition. And the tradition would further say that our entire science, our entire empirical science by which we believe we are coming to absolutely certain knowledge of the universe, is actually a type of gross physical science, and that the universe is actually multidimensional. To give an example, let's say you look on a one-dimensional map, and let's say it's like one of those tourist maps where let's say here's an important intersection. On the map, they actually draw the footprint of different buildings, which they do sometimes. And so let's say you look on your map and you see a particular building. And let's say you're supposed to meet someone at this building. Now, what if this building is 10 stories high? And so from the point of view of a one-dimensional map, all the people in that building and all the 10 stories are still in the same place on the map. And so in that way, our approach to investigating the universe would be probably perceived by people back then as being sort of one-dimensional. So that in a particular place, we are seeing just maybe the ground floor, but there are other floors. And so therefore, a typical modern scientist would say like, hey, I don't see what you're talking about here, but what if the office is on the third floor and he's in the lobby? So I think one conviction people had back then, which I think was rational, I mean, whether it's true or not, I think it is true, and that is that whatever we know or think we know, we do through consciousness. I mean, you don't know anything unconscious. I mean, you know everything through consciousness. And I won't get into the whole subconscious thing because it's not relevant until it comes to your consciousness in terms of awareness. And so, therefore, in this ancient civilization, they focused a tremendous amount of their attention on consciousness itself, on the instrument. It's like, if let's say you're an astronomer and you're looking through a telescope. That's kind of anachronistic because now they just look at computers. But let's say you're an old-fashioned astronomer looking through a telescope, and you don't bother to clean the lens. And so you think you've just discovered maybe 132 new planets. Then you realize, but it's just a bunch of dust particles on your lens. So, I mean, obviously, you have to pay attention to consciousness itself. And so the simple question would be that if consciousness in fact can rise to different levels, does the world look essentially the same at different levels? Or is it that at certain levels you can see things you couldn't see at other levels? For example, we know certain, let's say you play some beautiful music. What does that sound like to a frog? Or to a cat? Does it sound like music, or what does it sound like? What does it sound like someone who's not trained in that music tradition? Let's say you listen to some Baroque music. Now, someone who really has never listened to it, doesn't really understand the history, what's being expressed. So you see, I mean, even in terms of our experience on Earth, we can penetrate into different levels of something. I mean, take an X-ray. If you're not trained in how to read X-rays, to you it's just a bunch of light and dark. But to a trained technician, they see all kinds of things you don't see. So I mean, it gets into the whole level. Like if an ant is crawling on your hand, the ant doesn't know that that you exist. There's no concept of you. And so where are we really? I mean, an ant is crawling on your hand with absolutely no concept that it is a hand, that it is your hand, or anything like that. It doesn't have the notion of skin in its well, I guess it has a little head. And yet, in one sense, if an ant is crawling on your, I mean, the ant knows the freckles and hairs on your arm better than you do, in terms of navigating the freckles and hairs. And so, and yet, it doesn't have the concept arm, or hair, or freckle, or human being. And so we could be looking at a planet, we could be looking out at the universe, or looking here at the earth, and we simply may not recognize certain things. Now, I'm not trying to say that it is or isn't the case. I'm simply trying to say that it seems to me an incredible lack of creativity and imagination to, given the history of science, to say at this very early stage of the game that we know everything. But now we just have to fill in the details. We know all the basic principles. Now it's just a question of filling in the details. So, therefore, like typically in academic books that talk about India or any other religion for that matter, I think that there's a lot of pretentiousness, often, not always, but often a lot of pretentiousness and false assumptions, and an abysmal ignorance of the most basic principles of epistemology. Epistemology is the philosophy of knowing, like how do you know you know? And, I got my doctorate in this field. I didn't have to take a course in epistemology. I did because I'm interested in philosophy. But I didn't have to. It's not a requirement. So you can get a PhD in almost any field. You don't have to study the philosophy of knowing. And then you can use all kinds of meaningless words in your books, like this probably is this, and this most likely is that, and this probably never happened, and and what does probably mean? Like if you say, for example, that, let's say you take one of the heroes of this epic, or one of the figures in the civilization, as has been stated actually in classes like this, that, okay, this figure is probably just some village hero, that, and then the great telephone game, it got exaggerated and ended up being a god. And this is probably what happened. Now you say probably, it means more than 50% likelihood, right? That's what probably means. Something's probable if the likelihood is more than 50%. So is it that the scholars that say that have actually been there at the scene in human history and watched village heroes being turned into gods? And they've watched this so many times and know all the different circumstances that in a particular case they can say that mathematically this is probably the case. So I just mention this because, frankly, I don't think the university should be. It shouldn't be brainwashed or indoctrinated on this side or that side. Nowadays, because we live in a skeptical age, the intellectual culture of the modern age is skeptical, and therefore, a professor, like if someone in my position, is actually free to indoctrinate the students and preach as long as it's negative and not positive. In other words, I can tell you this never happened, this is all imagination, this is mythology, which is preaching. These are religious statements. If I claim this never really happened, that's a religious claim. So to claim the gods do exist or don't exist, so because of the skeptical tilt of our civilization, in a public university you're allowed to preach as long as it's skepticism and not faith. And so what I've been trying to do in this course is just be balanced and give both sides. So you can make up your own mind. Treat you like adults and you can make up your own mind instead of trying to indoctrinate you into skepticism or, to make you true believers in something. Boy, that was a sermon, wasn't it? Anyway, so the story itself. There was a great teacher, Madhva, who about 800 years ago in southwest India, sort of down here, Madhva, who wrote a book on the Mahabharata, Madhvacharya. He's one of the great Vedantists of Indian history, just one of the great figures of Indian religious history, in which he claims the Mahabharata text is corrupted, that the Sanskrit text, and he's a more than faithful. He's one of the great religious teachers of India, yet he claimed the Sanskrit text had been corrupted. So anyway, so what is it? What is the story of the Mahabharata that we're trying to figure out? I'm actually working on it myself, actually, a trilogy of the Mahabharata right now. So what is the story? I'll tell you the basic story, kind of leaving out some of the things that are sort of seen as obvious interpolations, and just trying to give you the basic central story about which there's almost unanimous agreement in all the manuscript traditions. The story begins actually in another world. The idea was that just as in this world there are good guys and bad guys, so within the universe there are powerful beings who are good and, and powerful beings who are not good, like the Force and the dark side of the Force. So the idea is that there was a battle, a conflict beyond the earth, and those who lost, the demonic forces, then decided to, they came up with a strategy to take over a remote planet and, so to speak, turn it into a Death Star to again try to assume power within the universe. If you study the history of insurgency movements, whether it's in Chechnya or Colombia or, North Africa, anywhere in the world, basically when a particular group is unable to depose the existing government, they tend to flee to some remote location like a jungle, a desert, rugged mountains, where ordinary, the government forces can't really get at them, regroup, recruit, and again march on the capital. And so this was basically what happened. There was an attempt to, the idea was to pick a remote planet and again, regroup and again become powerful enough to challenge the forces that govern the universe. And so the remote planet they picked was the Earth. The remote planet they picked was the Earth, and according to this vision of the world, and basically according to all pre-industrial societies, there is an Earth goddess, which simply means there's a very powerful feminine figure who somehow is responsible for the Earth. And so according to this ancient story, the Earth goddess went to Brahma, who is sort of the creator of the universe, not God, capital G, but the engineer, the creator of the universe, because there was this alien invasion of the Earth and begged for help. And so at that time, Brahma himself, it is said, had to approach his boss, Vishnu, or God with a capital G, and Vishnu then instructed Brahma that I myself am going to come to Earth, and I want you could call them the devas, the gods, the demigods. Basically, the idea is powerful beings who work under God to manage the universe. They were also instructed to appear on Earth to to create a counterinsurgency. So that's the basic frame story of the Mahabharata. That's the basic frame story of the Mahabharata, a very powerful alien invasion of Earth. I mean, it'd be a good movie if they ever got it right. An alien invasion of the Earth, and then Vishnu himself coming down and appearing in this world as Krishna. As Krishna. So the Mahabharata takes place at 3 different levels. Got a few more minutes. At 3 different levels. It takes place at an earthly level because the basic strategy of and the word, by the way, for the demonic forces is asura. Asura literally means the ungodly, and the gods are called sura. The suras, the asuras. So, you know Star Wars, like the Force, may the Force be with you and all that. So the same concept, I think I mentioned this earlier. Dharma, this force of Dharma, is in the universe. And so the Asura strategy was actually sophisticated. The idea was that as long as we follow Dharma, even Vishnu himself or the gods can't stop us. It's just like Al Capone. The reason they busted Al Capone on tax evasion was because they couldn't catch him breaking the law. And so the strategy was kind of to legally take over the earth. For example, by taking birth as human kings. Taking birth as the sons of human kings and then gradually taking over all the important countries. Also, this is what, I'm just giving you what the text teaches. Also, for example, taking birth as ferocious animals, because there's a Pashu Dharma, a Dharma of animals. So these wild animals could attack sages in the forest. They could kill all the holiest, wisest people in the civilization without really triggering a cosmic reaction because they took birth as animals. And so there was this strategy to take over the earth, and yes.
I'm sorry. So were they taking over like the ancient Vedic cultures?
Yeah, very much.
Okay.
Yeah, very much. In fact, these asuras who took birth as kings all had their Brahmins, because there's always a priest for hire. I mean, some priests are kind of principled, and some are just kind of like for hire. And the mantras themselves, these powers, like these, as they talk about the yoga powers, you perform austerities, you get all these powers through yoga, meditation. It's sort of morally neutral. In other words, both the asuras also were among the greatest yogis. They mastered these material techniques, according to the stories, these material techniques of meditation, self-abnegation, and acquired extraordinary powers. In fact, some of the greatest yogis in the history of the civilization were the demonic. You know, it's like the dark side of the force. Yes?
Are demons subject to karma?
Yeah, they are. And that's why they were kind of trying to navigate through this minefield of dharmic principles. They were trying to find a way to take over the earth.
How did they choose to be reborn? What they need?
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's just like the more money you have, the more you can actually decide what you're going to do. I mean, if you don't have money, sometimes you're forced to live in a certain place or forced to work a certain job, and so on and so forth. Or if you're on welfare, you're forced to follow certain rules. But if you have a lot of money, you have more freedom. So the idea is that within the universe, I mean, this is the idea of the text, that within the universe, as you acquire more and more power, it gives you more discretion over your own future. In fact, one of the facilities of the karmic system is you can acquire so much power that you can basically choose your next life. Also, they had a priest. There was a Professor White, which is a translation from the Sanskrit. Shukracharya, those from India have probably heard of Shukracharya. Shukra means white. Anyway, he was a very powerful Brahmin, and the asuras were his clients. And so he had a power called Sanjivani, which means that if his clients, the demons, if they were killed in battle, he could bring them back to life. And so by his power, and that's again part of this, these claims of this old ancient Brahminical culture. Through fire sacrifice, through yoga, they actually had all these powers which are lost to us today. So anyway, that's the basic framework. And then tomorrow, who knows? Monday we'll talk about what actually happened, this confrontation, when Vishnu came to this world as an avatar along with his gods. Have a good weekend.